And today on the program, we have invited Mr. Tawanda Chinhini from the Election Resource Center, who is here to talk to us about the recently held Kenyan elections. And we would want to know the use of the BVR, that's the biometric voter registration process, how it worked and how it can be implemented here in Zimbabwe. We'd also want to know youth participation in the recently held Kenyan elections. For this and other issues, Mr. Chinhini, you are welcome to the program. Please introduce yourself, say.
Hi, Lovejoy. My name is Tawanda Chinhini with the Election Resource Center, and thank you for having
It's good to have you, Mr. Chinhini.
Yes.
So let's get straight into it. In Kenya, they held elections. I understand it was also their first time using the BVR system.
Well, in Kenya, they've used technology since before. They've used it before.
All right.
But this was a second go at it. In fact, this was a further improvement with what they had done before. So I will not talk about BVR alone, but I'll talk about their use of technology in elections. Yes. So in Kenya, they do have a biometric voter registration system. So their use of technology in elections extends back to previous elections, especially after the chaotic elections that they had in 2007. Really, Kenya has been at the front in terms of leading on the continent around use of technology. Now, there are 2017 elections that were held on the 8th of April, of August, had extensive use of technology. One at the level of biometric registration. So they were able to capture the details of voters biometrically. So they took fingerprints. They did also take photographs of voters. And their voters roll sort of, increased ahead of the 2017 elections, and they had over 19 million registered voters. Kenya is a much bigger country than Zimbabwe.
Yes.
Yeah, but they were able to come up in a very short space of time. They were able to really get a huge chunk of new registrants at the beginning of the year, which was quite impressive. They also introduced the electronic transmission of the results, and which has now become a huge part of the petition that is currently in the Constitutional Court, the Supreme Court of Kenya, where the opposition is contesting the outcome, questioning the credibility of the technology that was used to transmit the results. So Kenya's use of technology has really extended beyond just registration, which in our case, we are only focusing on registration, but they've gone through to verification of voters using machines at the polling station, and of course, transmission of results also using technology. The advantage of that is definitely the speed with which information is transmitted is much faster. The removal of the human factor also improves the quality of the process. But as you will hear about Kenya, machines also bring with them huge vulnerabilities of tampering. Now, at the end of the day, what matters is how strong a system has become, how the election administration body communicates with stakeholders to guarantee huge safeguards to guard against potential manipulation, because with technology comes that vulnerability of hacking and so on. But in a lot of the cases, I think if you deal with the perception issues, if you deal with public confidence issues, the chances of technology improving the quality of your elections are enhanced. In fact, in the case of Kenya, where in their last election, must have been around 2012, the rate of failure of equipment on polling day stood at over 50%. But in the case of the 2017 elections, the rate of failure of machines was down to 7%. So they were really efficient machines. So, it's a huge decline. But you're also looking at the fact that Kenya, ahead of these elections, was able to set up a new Electoral Commission in a very short space of time. So there were concerns about the independence and credibility of the old commission that had run previous elections, with demonstrations from opposition parties, which resulted in government conceding and new commissioners being appointed to run the Kenyan election. Secondly, there was a lot of litigation around determining the election rules.
Okay.
So stakeholders went to court to get interpretation of the law, so that the rules for elections in Kenya would be clarified well before the election actually took place. So there was a lot of advocacy that happened, with the Supreme Court actually playing a central role in interpreting how the election would be run, which was quite impressive. Then Kenya also had one of the biggest contingency of international observers. I mean, they ran into their thousands, and Kenya had observers from almost everywhere. So there was very limited restriction in terms of who could watch the Kenyan election. And the opportunity to watch the Kenyan election was expanded beyond the polling day, which was also quite impressive. So you had your usual AU observer missions, you had your usual COMESA observer missions, but you also had observers from Western countries, because Kenya is part of the international community. So you had the Carter Center observing those elections, you had NDI observing the same elections, you had the European Union observing the elections, you had the European Parliament observing the elections. So there was a diverse group of observation groups, and then of course you also had domestic observation groups. What was particularly interesting about the domestic observer groups for the Kenyan election was that they did not invest in deploying in every polling station. So your usual election observation groups such as ELOG deployed in selected polling stations, and they were able to do more. So part of simply deploying observers, they also were able to conduct a parallel vote tabulation. Now this is an attempt to collect election results as soon as they are announced, so that you can test them against the official results. And this is a phenomenon that has grown on the continent. We've seen it happen in Ghana. It's a legal process. We've also seen it happen in Zambia. We've seen it happen in Malawi. Here in Zimbabwe, it has happened in the past, but of course, with very limited acceptance of it as a practice, not necessarily in terms of it as a result, but it as a practice is often viewed very negatively, and at times it's confused with people attempting to announce results before the official announcement of results. So Kenya provided a lot of key learning points when you consider the fact that we are headed for elections in the next couple of months. In fact, less than 12 months now, officially, based on the constitution. So for us, it was an important election to watch. But you must also understand that the Kenyan election is not yet over. There is still a petition that is before the court, the Supreme Court, and a lot of issues are being raised about the credibility of the election process, particularly in terms of the management of the results. And I think it's something that Zimbabwe must keenly follow, with the full appreciation that when you are looking at strengthening electoral processes, it is not just about watching the election day. Elections are a process, and a lot of what happens leading up to the elections is what determines the quality of the election itself. So there's need for that expanded scope in terms of appreciating what elections are. Furthermore, I think in Kenya, we also witnessed the fact that citizen participation in elections should not be confined to mere registration as a voter and to mere voting. And in Kenya, they created a crowdsourcing platform where citizens, beyond registering and voting, also reported on what they were witnessing. And these reports were what was used to actually influence near real-time response to the challenges happening in the elections. So whereas in the past you find that there's this obsession with observation, which is important, the thinking that we have as the Election Resource Center is that observation is still necessary but not adequate in terms of addressing some of the fundamental challenges that you find in elections. So our view is that you don't want to observe an election and simply document what you have observed and leave it there. That is not enough. The purpose of documentation or scrutiny of the election process must be to improve the quality of the process as it is still happening. So we don't say, well, let's give our recommendations at the end of the process. We actually say, this is what we've found and this is wrong. It must be stopped. So there must be an oversight element that allows us to hold the responsible authorities accountable so that they can improve the processes as the processes are happening, so that we can say the observation by citizens, the observation by observer groups is not just a ceremonial process,
All right.
which potentially endorses a very flawed process. We don't want that. And jointly with other civic society organizations, including ZESN, we are looking at improving our methodology of oversight of elections to ensure that the quality of our elections is actually improved as the processes are happening.
All right, great. Let me take you back. You mentioned something like there were 19 million voters, registered voters in Kenya.
In Kenya,
right?
yes.
From what? From the previous
About 15 million.
From that's
14, 15 million.
4 million, right?
Yes.
And then ZEC right now, they are saying they are targeting 7 million registered voters. From where we are right now as Zimbabwe, and in our midst, just to say we can mobilize 7 million voters as we head towards 2018.
It's all going to come down to the quality of administration of the process to reach the target. So the possibility of us getting 7 million registered voters is there. I think, realistically speaking, and with the experience that we've had from the continent, within 3 months you can register people.
How did Kenya manage that? How did they do it?
One, you look at a focus on the principles of voter registration.
Okay.
Principles of voter registration insist on the question of accessibility to registration. Now, the question that ZEC must answer is that if you're targeting 7 million voters, registrants at least, in a very short space of time, in fact, according to their schedule, they hope to attempt to register people through 3 to 4 phases of a total of about 72 days. So this is about a month, 2 months and a half.
Yeah.
It is possible if they establish adequate centers to do this. That's number one. If they establish, they get the adequate equipment, so the BVR kits must be adequate to be spread across these centers adequately. If they train their registration officials, in fact, if they recruit competent registration officials, because I'll laugh when I say this, because you see, if with the use of technology, you can no longer simply go out there and advertise to say you want people to act as registration officials or polling officials. Because you need people that are competent, people that have the capacity to use a machine, to use a computer, and to understand the use of the computer, and to do it fast enough to capture as many people as possible. Now, so you need to consider all these variables. And sadly, the current state of play it still raises a couple of questions. Have the equipment been delivered on time? If the equipment has been delivered on time, where is it being warehoused? Is it a safe space? How vulnerable is it? Now, you consider the recruitment as a variable. Who are the people that are going to be recruited to conduct the process? What are their capacities? Who is going to do the training? And at what level is this training happening? What is the deployment plan? So who goes where and how will they be working? What is the plan B in terms of either equipment failure or capacity being limited? So you can train a person to work the machine, but if the people are slow, what do you do? So a solid plan by ZEC that answers all these fundamental questions would help build this confidence to say, yes, we can get the 7 million voters that ZEC is targeting. But you must also understand that the phased approach that ZEC is proposing, the 72 days, will not be the start and the end. ZEC has indicated that, and I'm not speaking on behalf of ZEC, but I'm speaking in terms of what they've shared. Right. But ZEC has indicated that there will then be continuous voter registration at the district centers.
We should have happened anyway.
We should have been a continuous process because the law is quite clear.
Yes.
Voter registration is a continuous process. So this process will then allow for a mop-up exercise to happen. But remember as well, in 2013, I would suspect 2014, the Electoral Act was amended.
Yes.
And one of the amendments that came into effect included stating that voter registration for purposes of an election will only end 12 days after the nomination process. Now, that's weird.
Wow.
If you consider what international practice has been. Why would you want voter registration to continue after the nomination process? If nomination is based on candidates who receive nominations from registered voters.
Right,
so
right.
the moment you extend voter registration beyond the nomination process, what you fundamentally do is you bring the closure of the voters' roll
But
closer to the election date. Now, what that then does is that you reduce the time for the finalization of the roll, which is an important process. Number two, for the scrutiny of the final roll, for the audit of the final roll before it is formalized. Now, the problem that we will have if you bring closure of the voters' roll as near to the election as is possible is that all these important processes don't happen. So at the end, you find multiple voters' rolls being shared and people saying, well, we got a roll, but you are not assured that this role that you've gotten is the one that will be used in election because there are still processes.
Yeah,
that
they're
are
still
happening.
continuing. Yes.
So you need to be managing those things. So when you talk about the 7 million that ZEC must register, it's about having clearly defined rules around how these people are going to be registered. So you've got your regulations that ZEC has already set up, but you must also come up with what are called procedures. Now, procedures define what happens in the registration centers. These are not yet out. So you've got some gaps that still remain, gaps which have a huge bearing on the quality of the registration process. So at the end of the day, let's not focus on saying we want 7 million voters and can we get the 7 million voters. But let's also look at the quality of getting the 7 million voters on the roll. And at the end of the day, remember, voter registration is not an island on its own. The purpose of voter registration is to compile a voter's roll. So the voter's roll in itself as a product must also be something that we are closely watching. So don't look at registration in isolation by simply saying, let's look at, can we get the 7 million voters? So there are bigger questions that ZEC must be able to answer. And the earlier ZEC does this, the more confident stakeholders will become to say, well, we can have a process that is sound enough to produce a credible voters roll, which we can accept for purposes of an election.
Interesting. This is the program Youth and the Road to 2018. We have Mr. Tawanda Chinhini from the Election Resource Center, where he's giving us his lessons, the lessons that he learned from the recently held Kenyan elections and how Zimbabwe can take a leaf from Kenyan elections. Because if you look at it, Zimbabwe and Kenya, they are more or less the same in terms of everything. Right. Mr. Chinhini, I'll come to you on the issue about the Electoral Commission in Kenya. If I heard you correctly, you said there was a new Electoral Commission, right? Right. Back home, there's been calls by bodies like NERA and other stakeholders. They've been calling for the independence of ZEC, and they've been calling for maybe the removal of some suspected army components within the board. Right? How does this now come to play as we head towards the 2018 elections? We have got all those people coming out and saying, we want this, but ZEC seems not to budge. How does that now open up, the playing field as we head into 2018?
I think it's a very difficult question to answer. I think every stakeholder has their own strategy in terms of how they can motivate the kind of reforms that they would want to see. The question of looking at election administration as a priority area for reform is a question that is legitimate. I think when you consider the facts around who is administering elections, there must be a proper mechanism of assessing the independence of the Election Commission. Now, the fundamental problem with our elections is that the legal framework itself is not sound enough, solid enough to guarantee the independence that we're clamoring for at the level of the administration body itself. And that is one of the fundamental problems. So, for instance, as long as you remain with an electoral act, as we currently do, that makes provisions, in fact, almost 38 instances where it refers fundamental decision-making processes by an independent commission to a cabinet minister. The independence of that body comes into question. So you can talk about how ZEC must be independent administratively, but if the law is not strengthened enough to guarantee the very same independence, you may be backing up the wrong tree. So yes, let's engage ZEC and let's compel ZEC to be independent. And there are ways in which you can motivate independent behavior by ZEC.
Yeah.
But you must also deal with the fundamental question of the laws themselves. So we have a petition that is before Parliament that touches on the question of the independence of the Electoral Commission. And our expectation is that our partners that are looking at elections, other civil society organizations, begin to also look at how we can engage with Parliament and even litigate to ensure that the Electoral Act is fully aligned with the Constitution to guarantee the independence. So in other instances where political will does exist, the provisions of the law do not matter. And I can give you instances where in India, you've had credible elections being held on the basis of the credibility of the individuals running the election, not on the basis of the law. But in Zimbabwe, it's a totally different ballgame. So you must make sure that the rules allow for the very same principles of election administration that guarantee a credible election process. So part of what must happen is to focus on the law and make sure that the law is fully aligned with the Constitution. Now, there is no excuse why the current government must continue to preside over laws, particularly election laws, that are not fully aligned with the Constitution. What is the excuse? We had a constitution that people overwhelmingly voted for. We've had resources being pushed into saying, let's fully align laws with the Constitution. So why do we still have provisions with respect to elections that remain unaligned? So government must be held accountable. Cabinet must be held accountable. The Ministry of Justice must be held accountable. They have to fix the laws. So all the other issues can then come in. How do you deal with creating a framework of at least guaranteeing the independence of the commission in terms of how it administers independence means? You can define what professional conduct means. And then you can use that as a framework to hold each and every one of the people working with ZEC accountable, from the chairperson of the commission to the cleaner at ZEC, because that's international standards. So you don't have to say this person came from this space, although of course it has a bearing on the behavior of the individual. But you can actually, in a very objective manner, assess the performance of the individual office bearers at ZEC and say, no, your conduct here was not professional. Your conduct here did not reflect independence on your part. Your conduct here suggested bias. So if you begin to break down these issues, you evidence the allegations around the possible bias around some of these institutions. Now, if we keep these arguments up in the air, there are challenges, because people will simply say, well, that's rhetoric. It's you are easily dismissed. So we need to strengthen our role in terms of advocacy, so that we begin to watch the right things. We begin to create very objective mechanisms of assessing the principles of election administration, so that we can compel, we can motivate the Election Commission to behave in a manner that complies with international standards and the law. So it's a process that we must undertake. Fortunately for us, we have been working on some of these things. So we are able to actually break down what kind of issues you can raise with ZEC. And the fortunate bit is, the moment you begin to structure some of these arguments, it is very difficult for some of the arguments to be dismissed, because they are objective. They are backed by evidence. So if indeed there is evidence to suggest absence of independence, let's put it on the table. And we have started to do that. And it's a process. I think at the end of the day, I mean, this will never be an event, getting credible elections. But we must be able to assert ourselves as Zimbabweans to say, what kind of an election do we want? We don't want an election that will be disputed. So let's remove anything that will be used to argue against the credibility of our elections.
As it stands, let's just say if we were to go into an election in the next, let's say, 6 months, and with these legal frameworks that we have, does this now open for voter fraud and then disputes along the way?
No, as it currently stands, and we have a barometer that we're going to be launching in the next couple of days. As it currently stands, our state of preparedness for elections is very very disturbing.
If we have any.
Yes, our state of preparedness for elections is very bad. I think we are most ill prepared. There is no roadmap to the elections. So 12 months before the elections, there is no roadmap with clear signposts, with timelines to say by this date we should have done this. And if you are going to assess anyone in terms of performance of their job, one of the key things that you look at is a work plan. Does it have timelines? Does it have deliverables? Now, if a whole institution that is mandated with running a critical process such as elections has not even shared publicly to say, no, this is our roadmap to elections, this opens room for people to speculate around an early election. Now, if you are not showing how prepared you are, so someone can wake up and say, no, so we can have elections in March. The immediate response from a very organized election administration body would be to say, no, there's no way we can have an election in March because you have not. We have this schedule and we're working based on this kind of a legal framework. So we need to achieve this before we can talk about an election date. Now, in the absence of this, anyone can, any Tom, Dick, and Harry can throw around dates and say, let's have elections. So what we are being forced to do is to reduce elections to a ceremonial process where you simply say, let's have elections for purposes of elections. Now, what you need to understand is that elections are not about the event on polling day. They're about the processes. Now, the quality the quality of the process has a bearing on the credibility of the election. Now, if you squeeze the election process and say, no, let's have an early election. So you will be able to have the processes happening, but the quality of those processes will be undermined. So if instead of saying, let's give 6 months to voter registration, because you are rushing, you have an election date, you'll say, let's have 2 months to compile a voters roll. Now, if you have 2 months to compile a voters roll, it means people are going to have challenges accessing the registration process. That compromises the quality of the process. It also means that there will be no time to scrutinize the voters roll for people to agree that, is this voters roll?
This is what we want.
Yes. So there's no time. So you rush things. And at the end of the day, you have an election and somebody wins. But what that does is you set yourself up for a disputed election. And this is what we are saying we cannot accept. That is a luxury that ZEC cannot afford at this moment. ZEC is fighting legacy issues where people have questioned the credibility of elections in the past. Now, for us to move from where we've come from to a state where our processes are more credible, ZEC must be able to properly plan for the processes and to do so publicly so that everybody understands, everybody has a picture. To say, well, so this is what we can expect and this is what we'll see.
Voter education.
Yes, voter education needs to happen. There are a lot of these processes that must happen. In fact, ZEC, first and foremost, must be at the forefront of saying the law must be fixed. Because before you start any of the processes, get the rules right. But if the rules are wrong, if the rules are weak, you already set yourself up for a process that is vulnerable, and I will not say rigging, vulnerable to the question of manipulation, vulnerable to fraud, vulnerable as well to malpractice, because the rules are unclear. So you leave a lot of discretion to whoever is selected to say, can you go and run election? So when they sit in that chair and they're running election, they use their discretion because the rules are not clear. So they'll decide, well, for one to register to vote, you can come up with this and it's okay. For this one to register, no, you can't come up with this. And they will say, no, the law allows me to use my discretion. So you have to strengthen ZEC, like I said, in terms of ensuring its independence is solid. But you also have to strengthen the rules for the election so that these are watertight. If the rules are clear, it's like a soccer match. If rules are clear for a soccer match,
we have a clean match.
You have a clean match. The outcome is
undisputed.
Is undisputed. In fact, if you have the clean rules, it is very difficult to predetermine the outcome. But if you allow space for people, and this is where I have real issues with one of the statements that came from one of the heads of one of the departments in the Ministry of Home Affairs, where one decides to change the rules for voter registration by saying some identity document cannot be used. And so you need to strengthen the rules so that nobody can wake up and try and change the rules.
How is that going to affect, especially Vanima IDs, Mameta IDs?
No, I'm looking at the regulations that were gazetted in 2017 by government in terms of what they are defining as proof of identity.
Yes.
So these are the regulations for voter registration. They talk about an ID.
Yes.
They don't say whether it's metal or plastic.
Yes, exactly.
Right? They talk about a waiting pass. They don't say whether it's machine readable or not. They talk about a passport, a valid passport. Now,
it's vague.
No, the rules are clear. But here's the problem. We have a head of a department, government department, the Registrar General. His mandate is to deal with civil registry. Now, before this new constitution, his mandate, in fact, it was called the Registrar of Voters.
Yeah.
So I'm tempted to think that he still thinks that he has that power, which is really unfortunate. But the constitution has changed. But we can almost understand.
Sticking to the old order.
He's been there for a while. And there may be some withdrawal issues where one still wants to exercise powers that they used to have before. But the regulations are clear. And sadly, we need to remind the Registrar General that he can't be changing the rules. Now, it's important that he goes out there and issues IDs. There's no question about it. But he cannot then purport to prescribe new rules for registration by saying that if you have an old ID, you can't register to vote. Because that's not what's said on paper. The question that those who interviewed him should have asked is, which law was he using? Now, you have the Civil Registry Act that has not been changed. So for you to say that this ID can no longer work, there must have been some change in the law, because the law prescribes what an ID is. So it's unfortunate that such a statement has been issued. We believe that it's highly inappropriate for him to then talk about elections. He cannot speak on behalf of ZEC. And what's even sadder about this is the fact that ZEC has not yet said anything about this. Wow. Now, the material import of what has been said is that those that are holding metal IDs are now starting to ask, so I need to get my ID.
Another ID, another plastic ID.
Now, you know the administrative process of doing that. Are there costs associated to it? Which costs people may not have money to support? Number two, what becomes of the regulations as prescribed?
Are they going to change?
Are they changing? Is Mudede on his own changing the regulations? What authority does he have to change the rules of a process that must be constitutionally managed by an independent and different body? So the moment you allow heads of government departments to prescribe rules for important electoral processes such as registration and voting, we're opening ourselves up for disaster.
There's always, I mean, there is now confusion, you know, amongst especially the older generation, which is
No, they changed the rules. So I think this is a test for ZEC. They have a real opportunity to show Zimbabweans that they are not influenced by the executive through government departments. Number two, the Registrar General must be reminded that he no longer has any role to play in elections. In fact, the reason why we're getting a new voters roll is because of the problems we've had with the voters roll that he presided over. Yeah. So there is no way we do not want to see him anywhere near our elections. And the Constitution has said that. They have said it. ZEC can run elections. Yes, of course, it can then invite other departments to assist ZEC. But those departments cannot speak on behalf of ZEC. So I think the message to ZEC is that they must assert themselves. They must give the correct position to Zimbabweans. All right. Have they changed these rules? Have they now subcontracted to speak on their behalf?
Maybe it happened before you knew it.
Yes. And how independent is ZEC if they're allowing other players to speak on their behalf? So we appreciate and we applaud Mudede for saying he wants to go out and issue IDs, because there are a lot of young people who need the ID documents for them to register to vote. But let his role stop there. Let him go out and issue IDs. Let him make sure that people have IDs, because you need an ID to register to vote. But let him not play, I think he's overstepping his role. And he needs to be reminded. He needs to be reminded. Maybe he has forgotten, but he really needs to be reminded. He no longer has a role to play in elections. And Zimbabweans must hold some of these institutions accountable. So complaining about it may not be enough. Mudede must be put in his place. He has no
what
role
needs to be done? What can citizens do?
Citizens must be raising this issue with ZEC. ZEC is available. They must account to the public. That's the first thing. Citizens must ask ZEC to account. No, so you can almost understand that ZEC cannot respond to every media report, and they have said it. But there's something unique about this particular statement that has been attributed to Tobayamde, and I'm still hoping that it's a joke that he will change the
how
rules.
It goes,
yes,
especially
but you see, I think if we are interested in getting credible electoral processes, here's an opportunity for our voices to be heard.
Yeah.
So if we keep quiet, we are allowing some of these things to continue happening, and it would really be unfortunate. So, it's a call to action to every Zimbabwean citizen to say, well, which rule is Mudede using to change the regulations? Where is he drawing his authority to dictate how? He talks about machine-readable identity documents for registration and voting. There is no way, in terms of what Zek has shared, where it says that there will be need for machine-readable identity documents on polling. There is no machine that is going to be in the polling station on voting day in Zimbabwe.
Wow.
You only have machines for purposes of registration. And even at that stage, there is no insistence in terms of the regulations that your identity document must be machine-readable.
So that's the information that should be put outside,
Yes,
out there.
it must be put out there. So I'm almost falling short of saying it's a lie to
I
say.
understand. You understand.
I don't understand. The registrar of voters must understand fully technology and the question of documentation. If he has been following what Zek is doing, unless, of course, if he's going to be looking at running his own election, where he will need to administer the voting process, and therefore has some provision of machines that will read identity documents. And that would be unfortunate. That's why I keep insisting that I hope the media has misquoted Mr. Mudede. I pray it has
We
misquoted
all hope so.
Mr. Mudede.
All right, that's Mr. Chinhini from the Electoral Resource Center. We are talking about the state of preparedness for Zimbabwe and ZEC as well, ZEC in particular, as we head towards the 2018 elections. The program is Youth and the Road to 2018. You are welcome to share your views with us. You can go on our social media platforms. That's on Twitter at 263chat. You can go on our Facebook platform. That's at 263chat. Use the hashtag ZimVotes18 as we head towards the 2018 elections. Now, the 2018 elections. I don't know about Kenya. I didn't follow much what happened, especially with the youths. But for Zimbabwe now, we have got this issue, Yama IDs, you've got the issue, Yama proof of residence, you've got the issue here of voter education, and we as Vanavadiki, as my youth, especially the virgin voters, they need voter education. They need to be told what BVR is, and they need to be registered, kungevani ma IDs. Now, how important are they? Let me say, how important are they in all these metrics, and where do they benefit and where do they fall short?
Now, I think when you consider the role of youth in any process, you have to consider what kind of interests lie in the youth participating in some of these processes. So you can look at the question of elections and say, do they meet some of the priorities of young people? So in a lot of the cases, young people have distanced themselves from participating in terms of elections because of various factors. Some youth will tell you that we don't participate because the processes are inaccessible. Some youth will say we don't participate because the quality of the processes is so poor to the extent of making the processes useless.
So we just can't vote.
We just can't care enough. Some youth will say the process has been made so difficult for us to even engage at the very basic level with the process. Some youth will say when we express ourselves, our voices are not heard. So the role of the youth, sadly, has become sort of directed by those that are managing processes, to the extent of even dictating how youth participate. So where you find youth participating, sadly, they're participating from a very uninformed position. And I was about to almost make reference to some of the conversations that happened yesterday with regard to a huge event where youth were participating. But everyone has seen that the participation, how informed was the participation. So at times when we talk about youth participation, we've been told that our problem is that we then make the assumption that youth are not participating because a certain section of the youth are not participating. But when we talk about youth participating, we're not just talking about youth participation in terms of elementary participation. The ticking of boxes to say, did the youth come? And then you say yes. It has to go beyond that. It has to be quality participation. It has to be informed participation. So in the case of our elections, and in comparison to what we have seen in the region, the quality of youth participation in Zimbabwe has been poor, both at the level of actual participation and at the level of quality of participation. Now, that makes such participation ineffective in the sense that it's ceremonial. So you have over 50%, in fact almost 60% of the population being young people. Definitely that must mean that they constitute a significant proportion of those that are eligible to vote, right? That also means that they could easily determine the outcome of the election in terms of who wins. But does that also mean that they can freely express themselves? So we've been looking at by-elections, and this comes down to the quality of participation, where you do get young people going to vote. But what's the point of going to vote if they are not given options? What's the point of going to vote is if they are not educated to understand the process? What's the point of going to vote if they are not given information to understand the process? So there are elements that must be dealt with in terms of making the participation of youth effective participation. The moment young people understand the issues at stake in terms of democracy and governance processes, the moment they debate these issues publicly, the moment they get access to information, and they walk into a polling station to vote, and they're freely doing so, that's when we'll say, yes, you now have effective participation. So it's a process that we must engage with. It's a process that we must fully participate in. But we are just one organization, and the responsibility lies with every Zimbabwean citizen. I think part of what we need to be able to do is that peer-to-peer mobilization. As we're interacting now, not every young person can access the information that we're sharing. And I cannot purport to speak on behalf of all young people, because young people are not the same. They're different. You have rural young person, you have urban young person. So how are we getting the information out to them? Not to influence who they vote for, because that's at times one of the fundamental mistakes that we make. At the end of the day, everyone must have an opportunity to make their independent decision. And like I always say, the Election Resource Center is not in the business of then predetermining who must win an election. We are interested in the quality of the processes leading up to the election process. And we will judge the election process not on the basis of who has won, but on the basis of the credibility of the processes leading up to that. So our interest is saying, how do you get the young person to fully participate beyond simply being a registered voter and going out to vote? So how do you build the capacity of the young person to do this? How do you build the capacity of the young person to raise questions? And it's part of the democratic process. At times it's confused as being a front for regime change when people begin to ask questions, but it's not. It's part of the democratic process to ask questions so that you understand. Hence, my insistence to say, ZEC must not be fearful of people asking them questions. Because when they decided to sit there as commissioners or as members of the secretariat, they became public officials. And public officials account to the public. So we have a legitimate right to question. So if we're going to be registering to vote, we have a right to understand how the process is going to happen. And those that are holding public office associated with the responsibility of registration and polling must be on hand to answer our questions.
All right. In Kenya, how was youth participation? How did they manage to convince as many youths as they could just to participate in this whole voting?
In a number of ways. I think Kenya has a very vibrant media sector. Okay. So you have multiple media houses. You have very independent media houses. So access to information is one of the biggest triggers for participation.
Which is lacking here.
Yes, which is lacking here. So in spaces where democratic space is opened and the media is free, people tend to participate because there is plurality of sources of information, and people there's a thirst for information. If you create that space where people can say, I can get information here, but I can also get information from there, people then become more informed. Now, when you get informed, there's then an appetite that is created to say, okay, so how do I actually participate in this process?
You develop that will.
Yes, because there is an appetite to use that information to do something about it. People don't just access information for purposes of just accessing information. You access information because you want to use it. So how do you use it? This is why Zimbabweans will then twist everything that happens, and then, a skit is created, a joke is created. People are using the information that they're accessing. So it's the same concept when it comes to election-related issues. So in Kenya, they have multiple sources of information, and that is healthy for young people's participation. Number two, the use of technology.
Yes.
There is vibrant use of technology in Kenya. The cost of using mobile phones is relatively cheap. Access to data is expansive, so everybody has access to communication, and they use it. So that also creates a fertile ground for promoting youth participation. Thirdly, the Election Commission itself has embraced the use of technology. So people could check if they were registered as a voter via their mobile phone. So people could access the election administration body through a shortcode. So everyone can just talk. I mean, as an individual voter, you have direct access to the Election Commission, and the Election Commission is accessible. So that creates a fertile ground for youth participation, because young people don't want to hustle to participate in anything. They want something that is user-friendly to them. So if you're accessing information, if you're accessing institutions, if you are given space to express yourself, that creates a fertile ground for youth participation.
Those that are voting for the first time, they would want to access information on social media and whatnot. And then now we've got this cyber bill in Zimbabwe that's coming up, and versus the access to information. How does that intertwine? Where, no, at
the end of the day, it comes back to the question here, what is the real intention? I think...
And the timing as well.
Yeah. It just like with everything, and the timing. So the real questions that we must be asking is what's the real intention? I mean, it makes sense to deal with cyber security issues. It does make sense. But as long as you begin to infringe on freedoms of people, as long as you begin to then curtail access to information, then that becomes problematic. So I think government has a responsibility to be able to strike a balance. You don't want to perpetuate a perception that there is a real attempt to close space, to limit access to information through the guise of some of these laws that are then being promulgated. So I think government must really show good cause and convince the citizen. Secondly, is this a priority for citizens of Zimbabwe? So you can't continue to have a situation where policymakers act as an island and simply dictate what they believe is a public priority. So until you have a situation, and I think part of the problem is us as citizens, we've allowed our leaders, those that represent us,
and then let them do everything.
So we give them carte blanche when we elect them into public office. So they go there, they begin to make decisions for us, which is really unfortunate. Our democracy must be a democracy where there is constant citizen expression in the policies that are being promulgated. So if you're not seeing that reflected in the policy, if you're not seeing the citizen voice being reflected in the policy, then we have a problem. You have a problem of accountability, where those holding these positions will simply say it's good for you. What's good for me? And have I told you it's good for me?
So you even know what I want.
Yes. So we don't believe those sitting in these corridors of power are prophets who can predict what we want. We are here. They cannot pretend that we're not there and come back to us because an election is called. So it's also about us citizens claiming our space back, because we've allowed this to happen over time, and it's a culture of leadership that must be stopped. Because if we don't stop it, it compromises the quality of our democracy and the quality of the governance that we do get. So when we consider all these things as they're coming up, I think the first thing that citizens must be able to do is to collectively question what is happening. And this is not by any means a partisan endeavor. It's about the quality of our democracy. And we are holding those that are holding public office here and now accountable. And they cannot shy away from this responsibility of being held accountable. I mean, when you sign up to run for public office, you must sign up, you must know what you're signing up to. You're signing up to be questioned.
But then ours, they are, untouchable.
No, we make them untouchable. I think that's the tragedy of our democracy. We do. And the sad part is we find humor in what they do. I mean, we celebrate some of the mediocrity that we see by finding humor in it. And it's a serious issue. If we want...
They tend not to take us seriously anyway.
Yes. So at the end of the day, we do not matter. We are...
It's a shame.
Yeah. We do not matter. So here's the thing. When you then look at the long game of it all, you will find that those that seek public office know who matters to them. And guess what? Some have realized that the people actually who do matter in politics in Zimbabwe are the rural folk. Number one, because the rural folk are the ones that go and vote.
Yeah.
So there's an investment in ensuring that, well, if there's a drought, food goes there.
We just go there.
So there's a targeted approach of keeping and maintaining contact with a critical mass that actually makes the decision. And the question that you ask is, how come they're so convinced that the urban folk don't matter? And you can almost say that they are convinced the urban folk don't matter because the urban folk don't vote.
They don't vote.
They
just assume you guys work and whatnot.
But the day that they do realize that Zimbabweans are rising up and saying, well, you know what, we're actually going to vote. That's when we're going to start mattering. And that's when people will say, you know what, we must do something about these people. Because anyone who's seeking public office will definitely want everyone's vote. But if they are convinced that this section is not going to vote, they're not going to invest in what you're doing. They're not going to listen to what you need to say. So these are some of the dynamics that we need to deal with. At the end of the day, it comes back to citizen participation, which must be informed.
All right. And then we have the issue about virgin voters, them. How then do we tap into that constituents? How do we convince them that you guys, you need to vote? Because in the past, you don't vote much, but now I think there's a bit of interest from the guys that I've been talking to. There seems to be a bit of interest. So how then do we convince them that you guys, you can go and vote, everything will be fine?
It's a difficult process. I think it's a process that we should have started in 2013. To talk about it a couple of months before the elections is quite unfortunate. But I think it's not anything that an individual organization or an individual could do. Because, I mean, the population is huge. So it must be a collective effort. But it starts with you and me. How are we talking to our peers? What kind of information are we sharing with them? And at times, it must never be about prescribing how these young people must act. It must never be about such prescription. It must always be about allowing them to understand the value of voting. So access to information is important. And I always want to give this example. At times, people will say and convince themselves that my vote doesn't matter.
That's what they think. That's what they say.
But because I'm just an individual. One interesting aspect is look at the 2013 elections and look at how many urban council seats were decided by the drawing of lots because the candidates had the same number of votes.
Yes.
So that one vote does matter.
Count.
In fact, when you go to the Electoral Act, it says for a presidential candidate to win an election, you need 50% of the vote plus one vote. So it's not 50.
It's just not 50.
Yeah,
but it's 50 plus
one vote. So that's the significance of that one vote. So the one vote that each of us has is an important vote. It could be the determining vote to make the difference between what you want and what you don't want. So the moment you say my vote doesn't work, I think it's a bit worrying. So we have a responsibility at a peer-to-peer level to share as much information as is possible. And I know there are online discussions that do happen. But part of the biggest challenge that we have is extending these conversations offline, because not everyone accesses the conversations online. So it's a long-term effort. I think 2018 is an important process, but what we're starting to do now must be seen as a long strategy to improved quality of democracy in Zimbabwe. So at the end of the day, we cannot say that we'll get everything we need for 2018. But what we start now must be something that we sustain going forward. Let's build that culture of motivating each other and informing each other to understand some of these processes better. Let's also create platforms where everybody can speak freely. Just because we don't agree in terms of opinion doesn't mean that there is a huge problem. I think it's healthy that people support different political parties. But what's important at the end of the day is that there is informed participation, number one. Number two, that the quality of the processes leading up to some of these democratic events that we must have is credible to the extent that the outcome of the processes themselves are acceptable. We want everybody, winners and losers, to say, well, we won fairly or we lost fairly.
Yeah.
So it's not about who wins at the end of the day. The citizen must be the winner.
All right. And then on youth participation, okay, we talked about, and youth as candidates. We have seen the likes of Fazima Ere coming out and declaring that their ambitions, that she wants to run for office. We have seen the likes of Vimbai and Linda Masarira. How can we motivate more youth to come out and say, you know what, guys, I need to be an MP, I need to go for that senatorial seat, I need to go for that council seat? What can we do just to motivate youth?
We need to be able to explain that participation in democracy should not be a passive one,
all right,
where we're voting for others. I think it's, again, a long-term conversation. But part of doing this must involve us advocating for the necessary space to be created for people, young people particularly, to be able to freely participate. Now, if the legal provisions are inhibitive to youth participation, then you're not likely going to see a lot of candidates being youth standing for public office. That's number one. Number two, if the culture of politics is usually defined by extreme violence.
Yes, we're going to talk about that as well.
You will not see a lot of young people, particularly young women, coming out to participate. So it's not about merely standing up and saying, I'll stand. But it's also about participating in informing and influencing the environment, which is conducive for such participation. Hence the argument to say, look, let's have a wholesome approach to the question of youth participation. Let's not confine it to simply saying, let's represent ourselves. Let's not confine it to saying, let's go and register to vote. And let's not confine it to saying, let's vote or let's educate others. Let's have it expand beyond that to say, how are young people standing up and speaking for themselves and influencing the policies that define the environment and the space in which youth participation can best be influenced positively. So it's, again, a long game, and it's understanding the bigger picture. So when some of these youth do make it into public office, you don't want them replicating the same culture that has been negative on other young people's participation, and we've seen that. Some people who get into public office as young people, but they actually perpetuate the old culture and suppress other young people from standing up for public office. So it still comes back to strengthening the institutions that support democracy, to strengthening the laws as the starting point before all these other things fall into place. Now, if you focus on institutions and laws as part of creating a space for youth participation, what you do is you create a strong framework that allows young people from everywhere to participate, across the political divide to participate. You must never sustain your institutions and laws to the whims of the individuals who are controlling them, because interests will then creep in. And you want to guard against that. So it's a long process that we must then undertake in terms of understanding the bigger picture. It's not just saying, let's participate because there's registration, let's participate because there's nomination, because nominating people or nomination on whose rules, voting on whose rules, registering to vote on whose rules? Have we participated in influencing those rules? So why must we participate at the end? So the struggle is to guard against fighting the last battle. Registering to vote is part of the last battle. going out to vote is part of the last battle. The battle is before. The pre-election process
period.
And influencing the quality of those processes so that you create fertile ground for fair participation to happen, for fair contest to happen. Now, if you say, never mind the environment, let's just get into the game and play. No, it's not going to work.
Right.
You are setting yourself up to participate in a predetermined outcome.
As ERC, what have you done to make sure that we have that, there's that creation of that level playing field that we are clamoring for?
We have done a lot of things. I think part of our work has been advocacy for improvements of the election process. I've mentioned the work we've done with the petition, which was a citizens' petition. We have a couple of cases that are before the Constitutional Court, trying to make sure that we strengthen the legal framework for elections. We have been running campaigns. Communities in Action being one of the campaigns where we were encouraging young people to engage with policymakers and solution holders and supporting platforms where these conversations happen and accountability is demanded from elected officials. So going forward, we are looking at how we can also work at mobilizing for participation around the voter registration process. We are looking at how we can influence the administrative framework of our elections through engagement with ZEC. So we do not relent in terms of our conversations with ZEC. If it means we must write to them every day, we will, because that's necessary. They're a public institution. We will hold it accountable. And we believe through effective holding of some of these institutions accountable, we actually compel them to act professionally and independently. Now, if we're not watching what they're doing, then we leave a lot of room for them to act outside the standards that are expected. We also hope to create platforms where citizens can participate in reporting what they're seeing around elections. And we hope to use that information to engage and hold accountable every other state institution that has a responsibility to play around our democratic processes. So be it the Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission, the Electoral Commission, the police, the Judicial Services Commission, the National Prosecution Authority. We want to use all this information to say, hey, we are watching what you're doing and what you're doing is outside the law, or what you're doing is outside the norm. Can you improve on what you're doing? And the attempt is real time. Escalation of what citizens will report. And we hope to partner with you guys to ensure that this information goes out and people know where to report what
the media is always critical.
Yes.
Right. And then there's the issue, you mentioned it in passing, the issue of violence, especially the effects it has on youth participation, especially the young women, the implications that come with violence perpetrated by their members or the other parties.
No, in terms of the question of violence, we have been working with partners that are really focused on the question of violence. There is Heal Zimbabwe Trust that looks at the question of community resilience and how to address violence when it does occur. There's the Zimbabwe Peace Project, one of our partners as well, who also document some of the issues pertaining to violence. So we have been interacting with that issue pertaining to elections. We also work very closely with the Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission.
All right.
Now, the idea behind working with the Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission is that they are a key component of what's called the special investigative mechanism within the Electoral Act, specific to elections. Now, the way that mechanism works is that wherever instances of violence do occur, and remember, violence is a violation of human rights. So whenever these instances of violence do occur, we hope to escalate these issues by reporting them to the Human Rights Commission. And the Human Rights Commission has a legal obligation to follow up on the matter through investigation. And they have the constitutional mandate to instruct the police to act on these things. So, and once the police have been instructed to act, remember the role of the police is to investigate, is to arrest if necessary, and to prepare cases which must go to court. Now, when these cases are prepared, part of the mechanism suggests that the cases must then be brought before the National Prosecution Authority for purposes of prosecution. And once the matter goes to court, it must be presided over through the Judicial Services Commission. Now, that entire mechanism has not been used. So the law says if violence happens, something must happen. This is Section 133 of the Electoral Act. And the mechanism is very clear. The said parties, it has never been operationalized. So you continue to have incidences of violence and people getting away with it. So in the cases of by-elections, we have then tried to activate this mechanism through our partnership with the Human Rights Commission. And we have seen the mechanism more or less finding its feet. We're not yet there. But part of what will motivate the effective use of the mechanism as part of addressing the question of violence is citizens holding these state institutions accountable. So if we don't raise it with them, and we have religiously been writing to them at every by-election to say the law says you must do this, appoint senior personnel who are waiting for these cases. And if they don't do it, we then raise it, we escalate it, you go to court. You say the institutions are operating outside the law. So if, as citizens, we begin to do this, we are holding these institutions accountable. Once we hold them accountable, we limit the instances of some of the violations that we have witnessed. So part of dealing with violence must be an institutional process of holding state institutions accountable.
Right.
And citizens must be at the forefront of doing this.
All right. Maybe as we wrap up, one last issue about electoral reforms. We've had, like I said earlier on, we've had the likes of NERA and a whole lot of organizations coming out demanding electoral reforms from ZAC. With the period that we have between now and the elections, are we more likely to see any changes in the electoral body and whatever? Are we likely to see any electoral reforms? Any meaningful electoral reforms?
If I was a solution holder, I would give you a definite answer. Because I'll tell you, yes, it's possible, because I'm holding the reins to that. But we're only watching. Now, what you need to understand about electoral reforms is that they're time-bound. So if we begin to have voter registration happening, reforms will be immaterial. Reforms that happen after registration has happened. Once you get the key electoral processes happening outside the reforms become immaterial. They are cosmetic. They are academic. So the purpose of reforms is that they influence the process. You just don't want to have them on paper. And this is the big struggle that we have, because the window of opportunity is closing. So that's our sad reality. But again, it still comes back to the issue of saying, with the limited time remaining, how effectively are we using that time? So what are the key reforms that must happen? There are key reforms pertaining to the legal framework of our elections. There are key reforms relating to the administrative framework of our elections. There are key reforms relating to the political environment. There are reforms that must happen in terms of fixing the law. So Parliament must sit down and fix the law. There are reforms that ZEC can administer without having to fix the law. And ZEC can quickly do this. There are reforms that institutions can institute, such as the police, to make sure that there's no violence, to make sure that no one gets away with violence, to make sure that cases are followed through, and they're followed through in real time. So you don't wait until after the process has happened for you to address the issue. So we have very limited time. The window of opportunity to deal with some of the reform issues is closing.
So we are slowly running out of time.
So it comes down to how effectively we use the very limited time that is remaining. So whatever effort that is being made, it must remain as targeted as is possible. It must remain as informed as is possible. It must stick to specific timelines, so that it's clear that having these reforms, because if you simply say we want reforms, you can get reforms on the eve of the election. And people, those that are administering the election will say, well, you said you wanted reforms.
We gave you
reforms. We gave you the reforms. So the conversation for reforms must not be a mantra. It must not be rhetoric. It must be specific. It must be time-bound.
All right. All right. Right. Lastly,
I would want to see an election where, ordinary Zimbabweans can freely express themselves through what they think about the rules for elections. So that election where people say their mind, speak their mind, and they're ahead. I would want to see that. I would want to see an election where the ordinary Zimbabwean, regardless of where they are, have an equal access to participate freely, without anyone compelling them to act in a particular manner. I would want to see an election where every Zimbabwean can freely access information to inform their participation. I would want to see an election where those running the election are people that inspire confidence in each and every one of the voters. I would want to see an election whose outcome is accepted by both those that have won and those that have lost. And I would want to see an election where those that win the election do so on the basis of the Constitution, do so on the basis of the law, and do so on the basis of credible processes that are beyond dispute.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Interesting. That was Mr. Tawanda Chinhini from Election Resource Center. We were on the program Youth and the Road to 2018, where we were talking about the situation in Kenya, the elections that took place in Kenya, and how Zimbabwe can take a leaf from that, and other issues relating to youths, how we can, as youths, especially, I'm a youth, we can, go forward from where we are, and the state of preparedness by the Zimbabwe Election Committee, is it ZEC? By ZEC, right? So, if you've got any issues that you feel like you want to talk to us about, feel free to get in touch with us on our social media platforms. That's on Twitter and on Facebook. And don't forget to use the hashtag ZimVotes18. That being said, my name is Lovejoy Mutongwiza. It's been nice having you.
For these and other stories, visit our website www.263chat.com. Follow us on Twitter @263chat and like our Facebook page 263chat.